Hello, good morning or afternoon or evening, depending on where you are and when you're listening to this talk. I'm Jim Tolles, as many of you know, a spiritual teacher, blogger really at spiritualawakeningprocess.com, and I welcome all of you to tonight's talk, Spiritual Awakening and Hypersensitivity. If you're brand new to me, as some of you have discovered, there's a chat pod where you can ask me questions. And I generally ask that you keep the conversation pointed towards me so we don't lose people's questions. It's a very small space, so if people get into a big conversation together, I'll miss people's questions, and I want to do my best to answer whatever questions you may have. As always, please keep the conversations that we do have respectful to me and to others. It's all part of having a nice, conscious conversation to support one of another. And if anything I ever say triggers you, take that as an opportunity to notice the trigger. One of the big issues, and something I'll probably talk about a little bit tonight, is that we tend to blame the external world for feelings we have inside us. That's a problem. And it gets us into all kinds of trouble. So part of being sensitive is understanding what is sensitive, what is responding. And that includes to when someone like me says something and that triggers something in you. And the trigger isn't always bad. Sometimes it's a enjoyable trigger or a desire trigger. It's not necessarily a fear or anger trigger. So there's lots of ways that our egos express themselves and tell us what to do. And just as a quick check-in, if somebody could type in the chat pod, let me know that you can hear me. That would be fantastic, and then I can get rolling. Also, I tend to free flow for about the first 20 or 30 minutes. Tonight's probably going to be shorter. I've talked about sensitivity a lot. I mean, a lot on the blog and other videos. And there's a video down below from a couple years back, I think, that talks about being a highly sensitive person. Thank you, Pam. I appreciate that. So that's there after this talk. Some of you may want to look at that because I'm going to focus more on the awakened side of things versus a lot of people, they're just naturally highly sensitive. And that's a different thing than what I'm talking about tonight. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about as far as working with it still apply, but it is a different thing. So I'll free flow for about 20 minutes, and then I'll open it up for questions. So we'll have lots of time for questions, anything that's on your mind as far as dealing with sensitivities, spiritual awakening, we can get into it then. And also I want to let you know, if you're new to me, I do these talks every 2 weeks. So they alternate between a 10:30 a.m. Pacific time and a 6 p.m. Pacific time. And that's to try and deal with a lot of different schedules around the world, really. So the 10:30 a.m. is for all my friends overseas who are sleeping because it's 10 a.m. or it's 2 a.m. or like 3 a.m. right now in different parts of Europe. And of course, my friends over in the Pacific Rim in Australia, they can join for this one because of how time differences work. So they alternate. The next one's going to be about managing ego triggers, which I've already mentioned tonight. And I highly recommend this for everyone. This applies to everyone. There's nobody exempt from this. Oh, and one other last note is I'm working on a 5-week course series to help people learn how to learn. And that sounds kind of funny, but on the spiritual path, learning is a very different thing. It's not the same as learning in school where somebody just gives you ideas and you accept ideas and you move from there. It's not about the typical didactic conversations and discussions people get into. There's a certain way we have to understand our ego self to be able to even learn. If we're unable to understand ourselves, we don't realize what we filter out and what we let in, and that makes learning impossible at times in the spiritual path. So there's plenty of people who think they learn from me and they're not learning anything from me. They're just collecting what their ego prefers and keeping out what their ego does not. So that's in the works. If it's of interest to you, feel free to email me about it. And as I said, this is a 5-week course I'm developing to help people understand how to learn, and that will serve you well in many different things, and including not just working with me, but working with any spiritual teacher, any spiritual path. Because if you know how to learn, that just changes everything. It changes how you can open yourself and drop into deeper spaces of freedom. So that's coming. So things are busy. Oh, and I'm still working on the second book for anybody who's curious. And no, I'm not anywhere near close to saying what the title of it is or when it's going to be published, but it's going to be about spiritual awakening, obviously, and it's going to be a lot of wonderful things in there that I'm going to bring together. You know, the blog is so scattered, right? You've got pieces of things everywhere. And so having a cohesive book on the topic of spiritual awakening and the way that I'm writing it is something I'm really looking forward to doing to help give people clearer directed guidance. So let's get into it. Spiritual awakening and hypersensitivity. And I really feel like there are kind of three main types of people. One are the people who are already sensitive and who haven't awakened, but they're trying to deal with it. So that's kind of leads back to that link I was pointing to. It's down below. There's a bunch of links down below to an old video. So if that's you, after this talk, go listen to that as well. There are a lot of people who become more sensitive as they do inner work, and that's great. And so that's another type of person in this conversation. And the person who awakens and develops hypersensitivity could be one of those two people beforehand, but it's just the breadth of experience and stimuli that somebody is now processing that becomes overwhelming. So it's one of those things that unless you've kind of gone through this process, it's difficult for yourself to be able to place yourself on that continuum, because any amount of increasing sensitivity feels like hypersensitivity. And that's neither good nor bad. It's just learning to pay attention to yourself and understand yourself. So with spiritual awakening, very much we're coming out of being numb, of not feeling, of distracting ourselves. And so coming to a space where we feel more is very powerful. To suddenly have more physical sensations, emotions, and just overall like intuitive sensations, the energetic world, you know, to kind of suddenly hitting you all at once, or rather you're becoming aware of it all at once, can be a lot. One example comes to mind of a student who went to a movie theater at one point and just couldn't handle it. After her awakening, she just had to like run out of the place because it was just too much. And that really points to how numb society is, that we have to create these little boxes for experiences like movies and then blast people with noise and light, right? We have to blast them so hard just to get them to feel anything. But that's not our natural state in my experience. Our natural state is a much more open feeling space where we can interpret a lot of life and society and each other and ourselves in really, really great detail and in great levels of refinement. So what I mean by refinement is just how deep you can understand an energetic feeling and how well you can interpret it. And so another aspect that's overwhelming about hypersensitivity is we don't know how to interpret it because we're out of practice. So it's like 5 radio stations, are suddenly playing all at once, and it's just all a jumble. We don't know how to focus on one station at a time. We don't know how to tune in and tune out. And that really becomes part of the work, is learning how to tune in and tune out. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, because usually what we have to do first is to kind of come out of as much external noise as we can. And a little bit of seclusion can really help with this particular issue, because then we can kind of get things calmed down just enough to just hear maybe 3 radio stations versus if we're in the middle of a busy intersection or something like that, or at work, or doing things with a big family gathering. Right now we've got so much information pouring in and we can't handle what's coming. We haven't given ourselves a chance to calm things down enough to even feel. I often say you have to feel to heal, and that's a really big piece of this puzzle, because we acknowledge these feelings rather than running from them. And that right there is kind of the crux of the problem. The problem being that when somebody's really sensitive, they tend to try and get rid of it. They try to run from it in some way, through numbing, through distraction. And that's how a lot of humanity is living, hence the movie theaters. Like, they have to be that loud to reach lots of people because they're too numb. And in plenty of other places on my blog and on these videos and this channel, I've talked about kind of this deadening process we go through of we feel pain early on. We don't know how to deal with it in childhood. We're not given very many positive ways to let it go or to process it. So we learn to hide it or to suppress it or to run from things that look like it will cause pain. And so we start creating these layers of sediment. Right? And so these layers of sediment, however, are more like layers of nerves. So the more nerves or inner landmines we create, the more ways the external world can trigger us. And the more ways we can be triggered, the more sensitive we can feel to life. So that can be in addition to whatever our natural level of sensitivity is. So there's kind of this quality of sensitivities that are showing you where you're holding issues, and qualities of sensitivities that are just natural to you that as you relax into it, you get used to it, and then that's just how you are, and it's not a big deal. So it's the inner work on those nerves, those landmines that want to blow up when they get touched, that I point people towards so much. And a lot of it starts with just simply being present, being aware of, okay, I'm feeling a lot of things. What am I feeling? And as I started this talk, and I mentioned already, we're not blaming the external world. So you don't say, I'm sitting here and that guy over there feels threatening. He has nothing to do with you. He's just a trigger. And, this is just somebody across the way and is doing absolutely nothing threatening. Maybe just eating a sandwich, sitting by a pond in the park that you're at. But this sort of trigger comes up. And so then you start to investigate, well, what's going on inside me? What's actually happening? Is this a misunderstanding in my mind? And by that, I mean it's an association your mind has with the person over there. Because that goes on a lot as well. So early on, there's just a lot of pieces to start to unfold, and we have to slow down to be able to pay attention to. Is this some sort of mental perception that I'm having? If it's just an energetic thing, okay, maybe I'm just feeling it in my body, I'm feeling it in my chest, so I'll breathe into that part and see what's feeling really sensitive that I want to run away from this person over there. Because the opposite happens all the time. The opposite is somebody jumps to a conclusion that they think this person's a problem and they want to run away, they don't do anything with it. And what happens is now the person has been cut out of this individual's life in this example. And we don't know who that person could have been to the sensitive person. In the book that I'm writing, I was talking about the fear of black cats being bad luck and the silliness of that. And so, when somebody's projecting that fear onto a small mammal that has no ability to really threaten you, then they avoid it and they don't interact with it. And I take the example pretty far, but it's just to give you a sense of like how cut off we get from our lives when we start to do this, when we make decisions based on fear and these triggers and these sense of being sensitized to the point that we're under threat. And so like another person comes along without that fear and then, is petting the cat and the cat's very friendly and then sees the cat has a collar and wonders if the cat might be lost. So she calls the owner and the owner says the cat is lost. She takes it to the owner, makes a friend out of the owner. All those experiences are invisible to the first woman who's triggered by her fear. They don't exist. Sometimes people talk about this whole manifestation thing, and that to me is very much a Western culture spoiled brat syndrome. And what I mean by that is we are so spoiled, we can't appreciate what we have, and then we're constantly thinking about how can I get more? And for a lot of people, this whole spiritual manifestation thing is just that. It's just a means of getting more stuff. It's an attempt to make ourselves happy, but true happiness is inside of us. It has nothing to do with what you can create in the world. And the fact that we can create so much in a country like the US or Australia and other places is just a sign of how wealthy we are, how much stuff is already here. It's not that hard to bring these things into our life because of how much wealth there is. So on that note, I just encourage all of you to have a lot of gratitude. If you're online right now, that is a wealthy nation thing to be able to do, to have this conversation. You don't have to be making a lot of money by our standards, but to be able to have this interaction is pretty extraordinary. So gratitude is a big deal here. And gratitude for hypersensitivity as well. That, okay, I can now feel things So I can engage with things. I can learn things. This sensitivity tells me where the landmines are in my body, versus when we're not awakened and we can't feel these things, they're invisible. How big of a deal is it if somebody has an invisible cancer that is metastasized? That actually happened to a relative of mine. It's a distant relative who's passed away. All right, if there's no sign of pain, no way of knowing what's going on, then suddenly things break down and we can die very quickly, right? So pain itself is not a bad thing. It's a communication tool from our bodies, our hearts, saying something's up. We just need to be slower about assuming what that something is. So that's another aspect of the whole be present, slow down. If you feel very hypersensitive, if you're feeling a lot of different things, and this can go on different levels. Like some people, you can jump into telepathic experiences where suddenly it's like you're hearing other people's thoughts. Other people, it's not quite that pronounced, but it can be just having senses of the energetic of how people feel about themselves. You know, that will, of course, trigger some of the things about how you feel about yourself. I can jump you to the end of the story, which is when you're really clear in yourself. You can be with other people who are upset, but you don't get upset. You're just open to it. And, you know, it's kind of like a cold wind blows by. You don't get upset about that. So it becomes the same thing. If there's something inside you that responds to that cold wind, it shivers, right? That nerve I'm talking about, that's sensitive, that's you. And we can't hope to fix all the rest of the world so that everybody's happy all the time just to avoid our own uncomfortable feelings. It doesn't work. Although some people go into that mode, that sort of fixer mode. It's like, I gotta fix everybody else's problems and then I won't feel bad. Some people do this more unconsciously than others. The more unconscious they are, they don't even realize you're trying to do that. They just think everybody's wrong and doesn't know what they're doing, or they're unconscious or whatnot. So turning inwards is a much more permanent fix. And to be clear, since I didn't mention this at the top, spiritual awakening, when I'm talking about it, is a process that moves on its own. It moves 24/7, 365, regardless of whether you want it to or not. Most of the rest of the people are on what I call the conscious path. The conscious path is gradually choosing different things, learning more about yourself, and this is beautiful and important and much more common of the two. Spiritual awakening is like being thrown onto the conscious path and dragged by a donkey 5 miles. If you've had this awakening or you're in this sort of change, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, that's fine. It's not a big deal. What does matter, even more so if you haven't had an awakening, is dedication. Because what will happen is your ego will want to stay wherever it is. Or it will say, I'll go a little bit and then I'll stay there. Or I'm going to only go till I get what I want. So one of the worst things that can happen for someone on the spiritual path is they get whatever it is they are seeking. And for the ego, that's some sort of safety. It could be a sense of purpose. It could be a soulmate relationship. It could be some sort of job they really enjoy. Right? So these types of things will kill somebody's spiritual work. Because now the ego goes from trying to strive towards something, which we can kind of co-opt, and it goes to protection. And it goes to protection, says, I'm holding on to this stuff. And I don't want any more sensitivity. I don't want to feel any more stuff because now things seem good and I don't want to risk losing it. In spiritual awakening, for the first couple of years, you really would have a hard time doing that sort of plateau. And there are certain points that we got to get people to. And that point is where you've dropped enough ego and dropped into enough freedom to realize how trapped you still are. A lot of people drop a lot of issues and get to that plateau point I'm talking about. And as many of you know, this transformation and letting go of issues and opening up and feeling more things, it's not comfortable. So it's really easy to want to say, let's stop. We're done. I'm not sure what's going on with the audio. I've seen two people say they can't hear anything, but if other people can hear it, then it's probably not on my end. If it was on my end, everybody wouldn't be able to hear me. So sensitivities can come at any different part of us, as I said earlier. So getting used to physical sensitivities, if you've never really felt physically sensitive, that's part of the kind of overwhelm that can hit somebody at first. It's like, oh my gosh, why is all this stuff happening in my body? New energetic experiences can add to it. Some people feel that Kundalini energy very specifically, right, in the back and shoulders. Not everybody feels an awakened energy in that sort of level of specificity. But just, your body's vibrating, or you're having heat waves or tingles and bubbles. And that stuff actually, as far as I've noticed, isn't a big deal. Usually with energy, if it's getting stuck, so if it feels like there's a point that's getting pressured, or if it feels like there's some level of pain there, then we bring our attention to it. Bring your attention to whatever feels stuck, feels pressured, and breathe into that area and observe it. Be with it. Right? So in this way, we're joining with it. We're joining with the energy. Say, hey, what's going on here? The energy showed me something here. Now I'm going to sit with it. And another thing in awakening is you don't need external triggers to find any of this stuff. You could be with people or by yourself, and it keeps finding things. When you're on the conscious path and you have to kind of develop these things, being around people actually can be very useful as a mirror. So you can be like, oh, going back to the example of the man that seems threatening who's eating a sandwich by the pond. Just by being there, you can start to get a reflection back to you. It's like, what's going on? What sort of mental associations are coming up? What am I feeling in my body energetically? And breathe into that to start to get a sense of what feels threatened and why. And this sort of inquiry, as you get better at it, goes quicker and quicker. You just get sharper at listening to your intuition and understanding yourself. I would say some level of sensitivity don't go away. For instance, the movie theater thing, which for some reason I feel like picking on movie theaters. I don't know why. But with the movie theaters, I don't like going to them anymore. It's like I don't need that much sensation, and I don't find it enjoyable. Right? No different than some of you have very sensitive hearing. So you don't need to turn up the dial really loud on whatever music you choose to listen to enjoy it. Actually turning up that loud is unenjoyable. And so you just don't do those things. And if somebody was very used to going to rock concerts and going to movie theaters and having this sort of sensory input, it can be kind of surprising, and that leads into these bigger social changes that can be upsetting for people at times, because they're like, whoa, I thought I really liked this. And it's like, well, you can still like music and you can still like movies. You just may not go to those sorts of venues anymore. This isn't about limiting yourself. This is really about understanding yourself now. That you're already this really amazing, sensitive being. You don't need this. And this sort of social interaction doesn't work with you. And that's no different than anything else. There are plenty of other social interactions that didn't work for us before awakening. It's just we thought we had an ego preference, and now that has to change. In general, spiritual awakening embraces human change. It's this funny way where as we drop deeper into that space of stillness, of the eternal oneness that never changes, it clarifies change. It opens change. It opens this sort of intelligent change inside of us. Another way we can think of hypersensitivity is just like a seed sprouting, right? That seed kept you really safe in some ways. For the most part, it really actually just keeps us trapped. It's not a perfect metaphor. And then you crack open, right? And that cracking open can be surprising. And it starts to let in a lot of outside influences and inputs and stimuli that you've never had to really deal with before when this shell was there. Never forget the ego is just trying to protect you. It's not a bad thing. It's just unconscious. So it doesn't really know what it's doing. Or rather, we don't really know what we're doing until we start to look inwards at these different beliefs we have, different ideas about life, different ways of eating and sleeping, and all the different things that go into how we treat ourselves. And a lot of that changes as we start to appreciate our sensitivities. So building spiritual practices, that's a huge part of the whole slow down, be present, because it allows us to start to notice these things. Journaling is helpful to writing down, what you're sensing. If you're artistic, then you can draw out what you're feeling and to start to get better conceptualizations of what's going on. So you can just understand it. And in understanding it, it's less threatening. So hypersensitivity isn't a threat. And I think that's a thing to just let yourself sit with, because a lot of times the ego jumps to everything as a threat. And this also depends on like your upbringing, your beliefs, any trauma you may have, other past experiences, because we're all kind of on a continuum of, is life safe or is life a threat? The further you are up on that scale of life is threatening, the more quickly anything new, anything that feels unsettling gets put in the threat category and you freak out. And I'm sure it's easy for you to notice like people above and below you, like the person is super relaxed and it's like, you'll be like, oh, all this stuff is going on. And this person's like, yeah, it's fine, right? I'm not upset about it. And then how can you be so relaxed, right? So that's somebody whose life is not a threat, further down on that scale. And then somebody else who's just like, oh my goodness, I got the wrong coffee. And you're like, you got the wrong, just go back and tell them you got the wrong coffee. They'll give you a new one. But they're so freaked out, right? So that's just a sign of like where they are in that sort of threat meter of their ego inside. And since awakening isn't like equal, it's not like we all arrive at that at the same space. We're all kind of coming from different levels of threat, different levels of unconsciousness. So if you take somebody who's really high in that sort of threat meter, and then you dump more stimuli into their experience, they're going to freak out a lot. And some of those have some really bad overreactions. And that's a blog that I would recommend a lot of you read. It's called Overreacting to Your Spiritual Transformation. The further up you are, the more things look like a threat, and the more you overreact to try and fix it. And that can cause a lot of problems. Because usually people don't run to a spiritual teacher like myself to set up a spiritual practice to manage these things. That's not the social belief. They run to the doctor. They run to a psychologist. They try to get themselves medicated. I have had a number of stories of people spending thousands of dollars on those types of things from psychologists and doctors, and it just doesn't work for this. Now, keep in mind, I am a strong proponent of Western medicine and psychology and therapy, and all that stuff is really useful, but it has to be used on the right issue. Unfortunately, it's tough to really know a lot of things when they first happen like this, and there isn't a lot of cultural understanding around spiritual awakening, these sensitivities that can come. So it's not a bad thing to go to a doctor and make sure that your body's all in good health. I think the issue really becomes the repeated return visits, the constant trying to fix through that avenue when it doesn't work. And that's where people start to spend thousands and thousands of dollars. And that really is true stories. I can think of 3 or 4 people who've told me about that. So the slowing down and the building of spiritual practice, right? That's a way to help calm yourself down, because there's something about the triggered unconscious ego wants to go fast, wants to fix everything immediately, get it all taken care of and be safe, fix it, fight it, run from it, avoid it. It's all the basic primal instinctual impulses, because that's ultimately what the ego is built on. It's built on that fight or flight mechanism, predominantly. So let me open it up for questions, of different sensitivities you want to talk about, and I can offer some input. As I did mention, with anything very particularly physical and persistent, it's good to check in with a doctor, right? Science has done amazing things to advance medical understanding, and it's important to be clear on that level, that this isn't some strange actual physical issue. But when you get a clean bill of health from a doctor, and if you find meditation and journaling and these spiritual practices work, it starts to kind of suggest that this is a spiritual thing and has nothing to do with anything biological. And that seems kind of strange at times, right? That we can have such a biological response to something that's energetic and spiritual, but it's absolutely the case in my experience. So as people are thinking of any questions they want to write, and as I said earlier, please type them in the chat pod. Be respectful to each other and to me. I'll answer intuitively. I never really know what I'm going to say. It's just intuition. And for those who'd like to support me and my work, this is completely funded by donations. There's a donation link down below, and any amount is appreciated. Also down below are some other links to blog topics that may be of interest and that highly sensitive person video. So what's on people's minds tonight? First question, and I promise if I get people's, and I apologize if I get anybody's names wrong. So from Luquisa, I believe I had a sudden shift in consciousness. It's almost like I woke up around 4 a.m. and just felt like I had a new identity and perspective on life itself. I even started noticing synchronicities like the clock. Is this part of the awakening process? So let's step back. There are many kinds of spiritual experiences we can have, and some of you know that I, as a writer, have been defining a lot of different things. So the bigger bucket that I put a lot of these things into is spiritual opening, right? This opening of awareness to greater sense of love or peace or different perspective changes like you're talking about. I mean, as far as numbers go, to me, numbers are pretty irrelevant. Numbers are ways that the mind starts looking for meaning for the most part. So we see all sorts of numbers all the time, but the ego will filter out numbers it doesn't think are relevant and focus on the ones that it does. And it does this in a lot of different regards. It does this with ideas. It does it with all sorts of things. Right now, I really encourage everybody to keep paying attention to what I'm talking about, precisely because your egos are filtering me. Some of what I'm saying is getting filtered out because your ego is saying, I don't think this is important. And another part of your ego is grabbing onto other stuff. And whether you're hearing the stuff that you really need is part of why we do work, right? To start to understand our belief systems. And some of the things that are most important that I'm saying right now are going to trigger some of you, right? So if you get upset or angry, like I mentioned earlier, there's something there. And the same goes for if like you really get excited and you really like something, there's something there to pay attention to. What is this preference and why is it defining? So going back to the question at hand, synchronicities aren't that interesting. What's more interesting is the shift in consciousness and what else you just kind of notice about life. And does it stay or does it kind of stop? And by stop, I mean like it just kind of gets to a plateau where you see things differently, but nothing else is arising inside. If nothing else is arising inside, then this is a spiritual opening. They're perfectly common. People have them all the time. They're beautiful. And they need to be used as a way to encourage you towards inner work. They're showing you that you can see life differently. If you can see life differently, then that may mean that your current perspective is not clear or is not showing you the whole of reality. So this sort of perspective gives you like some idea that there are other ways of understanding life. And so you want to know what the filter is. You know, what is that sense of hyper awareness that you're talking about? Where is that actually coming from? You know, is this just kind of a body sensation? Is it a way that your mind is now working? And you can start to explore it. And I recommend, you know, writing things down. You know, starting to notice and acknowledge things like this, writing it down in your journal. It's great that you're on a quest to discover who you really are. But that also can be kind of tricky, because who is this one that's seeking? We got to be careful about what the ego may decide that you need to find, because sometimes it will try and find something before it really knows what it's searching for. So I really do recommend, it sounds like you're new, Luquisa, to read my ebook if you haven't read that already, to help you build a practice to understand yourself, heart, mind, body, and spirit. So in building that sort of practice, you can better understand yourself and these different motives, these different beliefs that are going on. So I hope that's helpful. Let's see what other questions people have. Got to make space for others here. And like I said, there are a lot of different spiritual openings, and you know, when the mind has an opening at certain times, life becomes very sharp and clear. It's really interesting. It often happens when the thoughts stop. So it almost feels biological to me. It's like all the memory process that was going on to like understand and remember thoughts stop working there because the thoughts go away. And now you have more memory to process all the interesting information and stimuli that are going on around you. I remember I was looking at the floor of a Muni bus in San Francisco, and I was just mesmerized by it because, I was in that space of presence, and I was just like observing, and I was just getting so much detail off this kind of disgusting Muni bus floor. So that is part of the beauty of being in the space of presence, and drawing our attention to presence is exceptionally powerful, and that's more interesting than all the experiences we have. The experiences, when they're used and understood properly, point us back to presence, help us to peel away layers and these veils of illusion that cover our eyes and distort how we see ourselves and how we see life. And of course, as the veils drop away, we become more sensitive. Sensitivity on the level of the mind actually makes you increasingly intelligent. You're just able to pick up information and different little things, body language, a lot of things that would have been invisible before. You pick it up so much quicker, and you process it, and you understand it better. And that's really powerful in understanding what's going on in any sort of situation in your life. What else do people want to know about spiritual awakening and hypersensitivity? This is from Will. I believe I had a full awakening, went through so many layers, and I realized how I was living, looking at life. I was patient, let things arise, but I seem to always have this belief that dramatic cliffhanger. I'll wait for the rest of the question here from Will. That I need to close myself off from or from others. Yeah, that's a tricky one. Right? So certain amounts of seclusion, like I mentioned earlier, to check in with ourselves are important. But this going back to the threatometer that I was talking about, the threat meter that we live on, a lot of times the ego is trying to self-protect. Right? It wants to get away from uncomfortable situations and places to get to safety. But the path of awakening, while at times there's this sort of seclusion to work through things we need to work through and to find ourselves and settle ourselves, is a temporary one at best. So there is a return to life that's inherent because this is an embracing of all of life. Nothing is left out. Right? There's no safe space to get to permanently be in, to be protected from the craziness of life, the craziness of the human body. So I just caution you with that, Will, to be mindful of that impulse, because if it's truly intuitive, it's very helpful. So I wasn't running around doing tons of stuff for a number of years simply because I needed space to be secluded. Now where I'm in life is very different. I can be in a lot of different situations and spaces, and it just seems like every week my energy is stronger, and whatever I can sustain, however dissonant or uncomfortable or upset the energetic environment is. Thanks for the question. From Carrie, do you have any guideline as to how much time someone should spend in personal care, yoga, meditation, etc.? No, I don't, because it's completely individual and depends on what's going on inside you. So somebody who has a really closed heart will need a lot of time and a lot of space to get into that and to open up. So, when I do an hour session, I've seen all sorts of different things with those connections that I have with people. And there are a couple of students that literally we just start and things are moving and coming, and it's pretty intense and amazing. And others need 45 minutes before we really start to crack into them. And some we've gone an hour and we haven't really helped them to open up yet. So just using that as an example, it just shows that people are all intensely different, and what they're working on and where they are is going to be dramatically different. So you can't think of time like that. That's in essence an ego question, because the ego is used to like, well, if you give me a structure, like how many hours a week do I need to exercise, right? That's that type of a thinking. That works for human bodies and exercise. But even there, as you learn to tune into your body, you're going to notice some weeks, you don't work out as much, and other weeks you work out more. So there's a real Western intellectual construct around structure. Structure can be useful at times, but it can be really, really problematic. So the first thing really is kind of understanding yourself a little bit more. I think meditation is always a good one. I usually recommend a half hour. It's just a good way to settle people down. You may notice that that's not enough, and maybe you need 45 minutes or an hour. And you can explore with that to find out, what times, where do you shift? Where does your sense of awareness, where does your perspective shift? Because I've found, like for me, pretty consistently between 18 and 24 minutes of meditating, there's a shift in there. Some days it's really quickly at about 18 minutes. And so if I were to meditate 15 minutes, that would be useless to me. So for meditation, you start to understand yourself better, and you can kind of get a better sense of what's moving for me. Is it emotional? Am I need to expand my mind, right? So if you need to expand your mind, yoga is not really the best one for you, right? Then you end up in things like this, and you can read spiritual blogs, and journaling is very mental. You can read stuff by Eckhart Tolle. You can listen to Muji, right? So now that's more mental work, although there's definitely some energy to Muji, as well as to me and some other spiritual teachers. So it's not something I can give a hard answer. I give it kind of individually, and it's important to pay attention to yourself and like what you're working on. I would say for you right now, Carrie, the mental aspect's the most important, to kind of make space for understanding the other things that may come up emotionally and physically and energetically, but I can't give you amount of time. Thanks for the question, though. What else do people want to ask? Hi, Christina. From Christina, I've read that the ego can leave the body and the body would stay on Earth until its time was done. Do you believe or have any insight into whether or not ego should be dispelled entirely? Well, I think firstly, let's step back and let's define ego. So when I talk about the ego, I'm talking about an identity. I'm talking about a collection of beliefs and past experiences that are informing those beliefs that create up the sense of who we are, what we want to experience, and what we don't. And that's our big filter on life. So it's deciding in a host of semi-conscious ways where we know we're making decisions, and a whole bunch more unconscious ways, what we will do, what we can do, what we can't do, and all that sort of stuff. So in that sense, to me, the ego is very much a corporal thing. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a lens, and we just don't realize we're wearing it. So I also make a distinction between the unconscious ego, the part of you that doesn't realize that you're made up. Right? The way we think about ourselves, that's all made up. And the conscious ego knows that it's made up, and it's just a way of interacting with life. And we don't want to assume too quickly that we are into the conscious ego because of how much unconscious stuff is running in the unconscious ego. So that's where the work is, to understand this thing and to release more levels of unconsciousness so we know who we are. And we don't really have to worry too much about, what the body would do. I just don't think that this is going to really help you to have this idea, right? That's another thing about the ego. The ego likes ideas. That's the irony of talking about egos, is a lot of that comes from the ego itself. So don't worry about dispelling anything. It's not a bad thing. It's just unconscious. It doesn't know what it is. So following up for Will, how would you go about releasing pain, stuck emotion within the body that holds back feelings, urges, and true expressions? That's an idea. It just sounds like there's a part of you that doesn't want to feel things. So there's a lot of probably key moments earlier in childhood where there was something upsetting that you could probably journal about and look into, saying, okay, so when did I start to learn that pain was bad? What does pain mean to me? Right? That's a really good question, actually. It's like, what does pain mean to you? Because pain to one person is different than to another. So like somebody doing public speaking, that could be very painful for one person because there's this idea of being seen or speaking or something else entirely that makes that painful versus somebody else doing public speaking. They're just completely comfortable with it. They're just yada, 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 yada. You know, they just go on and on. It's super, super easy. So that's not painful for them. So that's just something else to kind of pay attention to. It's like, what is pain and what's determining that pain? Like physical pain is different than emotional pain. But if we get emotional and psychological pain going enough, we can cause physical pain. And that's some of the stuff that we release after awakening. So, Will, in that one, I would say go looking for the past experiences and the ideas that say that I can't have a certain experience. And don't worry about true expression. Some follow-ups from Carrie. When you say shift, can you be more specific? I usually get twitching or a wonderful sensation. I don't cry or have any pain or feel like I'm resolving anything. I seem to release in therapy, but I don't seem to get a release from meditation. Well, you don't have to get a release from meditation. So every spiritual tool is slightly different. Shift is just the way my mind works. So it tends to quiet down. So that's what that shift meant when I was talking about it. It just calms down and everything just seems more peaceful in my head. From Jad, I wanted to ask you about feeling a great tension in the shoulders and neck, which creates a need to stretch intensely. This almost feels like ripping apart from my body. That's pretty intense. It's another thing that through breathing and relaxing and paying attention, you can start to explore. So that's something that you probably want to start with some yoga, just doing yoga regularly to see, is this a physical thing? Does this have to do with how you're seated? And of course, you know, something happening up in the back and shoulders may be originating from down in the pelvis because that's how muscles work. Muscles are all interconnected. That's a big theme we talk about on the spiritual path because everything is connected. So start with the physical first, then move back to something sort of energetic. And, you know, maybe you want to talk to a physical therapist or a doctor, right, to explore these things in the physical realm so that if there's nothing there, then it's easier to just come to a conclusion. Well, maybe it's an energetic blockage, right? Because I think that's why you're asking me this question. I don't want to jump to that conclusion too quickly. You know, we want to appreciate the nature of the body and the nature of having to take care of it. Depending on how sedentary your lifestyle is, Jad, then that impacts you. Right? A sedentary lifestyle does interesting things to the musculature and the hips and the pelvis, and that pulls on everything else in the legs and the back. But I think as a metaphor, it's really powerful, right? So appreciating that we want to get to the root of something, that the surface level sensitivity, surface level experience is often just the flower, right? It's the flower of the plant. It's not the roots. So yeah, I would point you towards the physical. That's what's intuitively coming up right now, Jad. So exploring yoga, maybe physical therapy, maybe talking to a doctor, a massage therapist, somebody who understands the body, a somatic worker. Start there, and then you can start to eliminate things and explore. And if nothing else, regular yoga is just good for us anyway, if you're not already doing it. You're welcome, Christina, for the insights. Thanks for your questions, everyone. So we still have time for a few more questions. If anyone's just joined me, I'm Jim Tolles. My blog at spiritualawakeningprocess.com. And for anyone who wants to support me, there's a donation link down below, as well as some other links to information you may be curious about. Carrie is asking about journaling. There's a couple ways that I suggest that. One is free flow, where if you've never really done much journaling, you don't feel good about your writing, then you just learn to write. Just write. You don't try and get into an issue, just write for several pages, see what comes out, to kind of break any impasses. So that's good for people if they're not comfortable with writing and have a lot of self-judgment. You don't pick up the pen, you don't self-edit, you just write. That's free writing. Questioning is really helpful. So questioning beliefs in particular, when we have a belief that, going back to this metaphor of the man who doesn't feel good who's eating his lunch by the pond that I've been using today, then you can say, okay, why do I not feel good? And if a belief comes up saying, well, he looks scary, it's like, well, why does he look that way? What about him is scary, right? And then you can get some answers. And it's like, well, he looks like this, or he looks like that. And it's like, okay, so why do those looks seem scary to me? Why am I interpreting this as a threat? And you can kind of start to peel away certain layers, and you may get to some memories of somebody who looks similar. I mean, that's the thing about these unconscious associations that I can't emphasize enough, right? They can be part of this hypersensitivity because we learned early on that some man who looks a certain way is a threat, right? We felt uncomfortable. Maybe this guy reminds you of the bus driver that was really creepy at your school, but there was no traumatic event. It's just that was a belief that got stuck and then got forgotten, but not completely. And so that association kicks in every time somebody looks like that old bus driver, including this man sitting by the pond eating his lunch. So this sort of questioning back of beliefs is very, very powerful. And we can do that with different sensitivities to say, what is this? How do I feel it in my body? And breathing into it and bringing attention to it. So those are the two that come to mind. And there's a lot of different things. I mean, other people, probably have more extensive blog posts about journaling. I'm glad that's helpful. Thanks for the question. As I mentioned earlier, the more you do this work and you clear out these old landmines, calm these old nerves and resolve them, being sensitive is great. You feel lots of things. You can connect really deeply with people more easily, and you can sense how those connections work, where they don't work. Because there are definitely sort of natural alignments between people that if two people allow them, then they can really do their own thing. Sometimes energetic connections are so strong that they go beyond people's ego defenses, and usually when that happens, that's somebody gets placed in the soulmate twin flame category or something very dramatic. Although usually those are very initial connections people make, and they don't realize that that's just like an opening salvo to like all the different amazing connections you can have. So if anyone ever feels like they have found one or are with a soulmate or twin flame, don't stop there, right? That's just the beginning of connection. It's not the end of it. And romantic connection isn't the most or only interesting connection out there. So a question from Jessica. I find that I still experience a lot of neurotic tendencies to the same degree as before I experienced some moments of spiritual awakening. Yeah, that's because it's time to do your work. With a spiritual awakening, even if it is kind of driving you along, like the metaphor of the donkey dragging you down the street, that doesn't take away the work you have to do, right? We're kind of training that donkey, I suppose, in this metaphor. We have to teach it to understand life. And sometimes in some of the Sufi poetry, they talk about the human body kind of like a donkey that has to be trained. So that's metaphors like the soul is Jesus, and Jesus will get mentioned in some of those stories like Rumi does. And the donkey is like the human body, and it's like if we don't train it, if we don't discipline it, it'll keep kind of rambling off with those sort of neurotic tendencies. Jessica follows up, in those same moments I have also experienced seeing the semi-fallacy of free will. So I'm wondering what your perspective might be in regards to any kind of healing within our shared context where we are all ultimately just living paradoxes. I hope my question makes sense. Thank you for your time and insights. Yeah, there's a lot there. Free will could be a whole topic here. I think there are extents of free will, and as we do our inner work, we expand that extent. Human beings are inherently limited, but our ego limits us more. So doing this sort of inner work to resolve different things and using sensitivity as a means to guide us towards the parts of us that are still holding on or the neurotic tendencies that are still firing and confusing us is really, really helpful to release those limitations and to become more free and to maximize whatever amount of free will we have, whatever amount of perspective we have. In some regards, the human perspective is just like our eyes. Like I can't see behind my head. But because my eyes are open, because I'm aware, I know I can't see behind my head. So being open gives us that perspective of what we can see and what we can't. And what we can't see, we can learn to ask for help, or we can appreciate that limitation. Versus when we're unconscious, our eyes are closed. We can't see things. We don't know what's going on. And we tend to try and guess too. We tend to guess badly about what's actually happening. We make up crazy stories, like all the god stories and mythology, right? Zeus must be angry, right? We're having lots of lightning and thunder. No, that's just clouds and storms. That's not Zeus punishing the Greeks. But this same type of guessing still goes on. There's all kinds of superstitions and crazy things that people come up. And just because we're not saying Zeus is doing this doesn't mean we're not creating some other story about this. Because when our eyes are closed, we don't know what's happening. And we don't like that feeling. We want to think we can control things through ideas in this culture. And so we make up more ideas. And all that limits our free will. Because our eyes are closed, we can't see. And we're guessing now. And we're guessing wrong a lot. So healing is perfectly possible. And as far as paradoxes, this is something I mentioned in a blog post. I can't remember the name of it, but it's like I wrote it in May. So if you go search on paradoxes, Jessica, on my blog, spiritualawakeningprocess.com, you'll probably find it because there's only one, I think, with that title. But paradoxes are a problem of our language, not of reality. So we're all one, but yet we're separate. That's a paradox because of our language, not because of reality. Does this make sense to people here? That oneness is. So if we think of all of us like water, like everything is water, but like I'm ice and that wall is ice, right? So that's still all water. It's just in a different state. Because of our language and our linguistic structure, we have set it up that one thing can't be another thing as well. It can only be that one thing. And so then we create this other idea called paradox. Like, wow, it's like two things and it shouldn't be, right? That's our fault. That's not reality's fault. The spiritual path and the healing and the opening we do is about seeing reality, not getting caught up in our linguistic structure when it's wrong. Does that make sense? If it doesn't make sense to somebody here, not just Jessica, please chime in. And if any of my answers didn't make sense, please ask a question. We've got 3 minutes left. I'm happy to answer it. It's a question from Proctor. Any tips on discipline for the inner work to take place? I often get carried away by the monkey mind and become unaware of where I was before. Discipline is kind of one of those chicken and egg stories. You just have to do it and keep doing it and keep coming back to the present moment. And that's how discipline works. It's like if you want to get good at running, you run and then you run the next day and you run the next day. So it's just your own inner willingness, and nobody can really decide that for you. And there's no technique for it. It's just your own dedication. And you reap the benefits. And Jessica says, I haven't thought of it like that before. I appreciate that perspective of language in regards to paradoxes. You're welcome. As I said, go find that blog, because that'll talk more about it. It also talks about the power of simplicity, I think, in that one. So this will be the last question before I close down. This is, what is your perspective on karma? What do you do to one another you do to yourself? Is the soul harmed by your intentions in this regard? I don't like to really get into the soul harming thing, because I feel like that's another way where things start to become cerebral. And whenever possible, we want to make this real world. So don't worry about harming your soul. Look at the ego and the harm that you do to yourself already. And there's usually plenty of ways that we self-harm, like negative thinking, where we're constantly saying we don't like ourselves, or projecting our anger onto other people. There's plenty there to work on as far as that goes. The question of what you do to another, you do to yourself, goes back to oneness, right? That we're all one. So we can't interact with something without doing something else. We're learning this lesson on the environmental level right now, right? We're learning that if we dump a bunch of plastic into the ocean, it's ending up in fish, and we're probably eating that, right? So when we do things that self-harm the environment, it's coming back to us, right? If we dump a bunch of carbon dioxide into the air, it has repercussions. We're doing it to ourselves. We're breathing that stuff too. So in a very grounded way, we are learning that law that we're interdependent and interconnected in this world right now. And it's a tough one. And we need to learn it, because we're going to make ourselves increasingly sick. And as far as karma goes, I think I'm going to leave that one alone for tonight, because I think that's a whole other thing that I could talk about for another hour as far as what karma is. And for the most part, I usually just use a more neutral term, and I'll talk about issues. issues that we have to deal with, things we're holding on to, false beliefs, old pain from childhood, these types of things. So thank you everybody for your questions and for being engaged. I appreciate it. I'm going to send you lots of love. As I said, I'll be back in 2 weeks at 10:30 a.m. We'll be talking about managing ego triggers. I highly recommend everybody come. It gets announced on the blog, and that's where you can sign up to get a reminder. And have a beautiful rest of your morning, your evening, your afternoon, wherever you may be. Take care, everybody.